The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." He replied, "What do you wish for me to do for you?" They answered him, "Grant that in your glory we may sit one at your right and the other at your left." Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism with I am baptized?" They said to him, "We can." Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right or at my left is not mine to give, but is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they became indignant at James and John. Jesus summoned them and said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones make their authority over them felt. But it shall not be so among you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you will be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you will be the slave of all. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as the ransom for the many." The Gospel of the Lord. Once upon a time, the board of directors of the ArcelorMittal Steel Corporation felt it was time for a shakeup. So they hired a CEO, and this CEO was determined to rid the company of all slackers. On a tour of the facility, the new CEO noticed a guy leaning against the wall. The room was full of workers, and he wanted to let them know that he meant business. He walked up to the guy at the wall and asked, "How much money do you make a week, pal?" A little surprised, the young man looked at him and replied, "I make about $400 a week. Why you ask?" The CEO then reached into his pocket and handed the guy $1,600 in cash and screamed, "Here's 4 weeks' pay. Now get out and don't come back." The guy left without saying a word to the CEO. Now, feeling pretty full of himself, the CEO looked around the room and asked, "Does anyone want to tell me what that goof-off did around here?" From across the room came a voice. "Pizza delivery guy from Domino's." The title of that story is Oops. Today's gospel appears in Matthew chapter 20 and Mark chapter 10, which I just proclaimed. And what's interesting in Mark's version of this story, we have the third time that Jesus speaks to the disciples about the meaning of true discipleship. And he does so now after having forecasted his passion for the third time. Looking back about a month ago for our gospel from Mark chapter 8, Jesus predicted his passion for the first time. And you remember what happened. No sooner than he's talked about this humiliating death that he was going to endure, Peter pulls him over the side and starts rebuking Jesus. And he says, don't talk like that. Everybody knows the Messiah is supposed to be a big cheese victorious Messiah. This suffering stuff doesn't fit. And you remember what Jesus did? He looked at Peter and he called him a Satan. Said, "Get behind me, you Satan. You're thinking the way humans think, not the way God thinks." And then in chapter 9, Jesus predicts his passion again. No sooner than he predicts his passion, he notices while he's talking out of the corner of his eyes that his disciples are yapping at one another while he's talking. And so they get inside the house and the disciples sit down with Jesus, and Jesus looks at them and says, what were you talking about along the road? And immediately they have that caught look. Thomas, you know what I'm talking about, that caught look. And they put their heads down. They're ashamed. They're embarrassed because they've been discussing who was the greatest. Jesus does his passion prediction a third time. And look what happens this time. We're told that James and John come forward. They are brothers. They are the sons of a man named Zebedee. The Greek word for Zebedee means thunder. So they are sons of thunder. And they approach Jesus with a request. Now what's interesting, if you go to Matthew's account, in Matthew chapter 20, it's not the boys who come to Jesus with requests, it's their mommy. Mommy does it for them. But here the boys come forward. And look what they say. You know, Lord Jesus, you know, when you get into your kingdom thing, we would like to have places of honor and privilege, one at your right and the other at your left. This is just after Jesus predicted his passion the third time. Can you imagine the look on the Lord's face? Total frustration. And he looks at them and says, you're kidding, right? Can you drink from the cup that I'm about to drink? That word cup is used in two senses in the Bible. On one hand, it refers to joy and blessing. If you go to Psalm 22, verse 5, it's about God's blessing cup that he gives to his beloved people. But more often than not, and especially and supremely so in the book of the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 23, verses 31 to 33, it is a metaphor for suffering, humiliating, degrading suffering of the individual. And that's what Jesus is talking about. And so he looks at them and he says, can you do this? Can you drink this cup? And they just very naively, because they're clueless, oh, sure we can. Yeah, no problem. And then Jesus says, well, you know, I'm going to undergo a baptism. Can you endure the baptism that I'm going to go through? The word baptismo from the Greek means to plunge or to put under water. And it's used always in the Bible to refer to overwhelming suffering, such as we find in the book of Job, chapter 9, verse 3. Their response, oh yeah, we can do that. Maybe they're thinking about sprinkling some water on their heads. Well, Jesus sets them straight. He says, look, if you follow me, you're going to drink from the cup, all right. You're going to be baptized with the baptism I'm going to receive as well. But sitting at my right or my left, it's not mine to give. Only one can bestow that privilege, and that is my Father. Jesus is predicting his passion. They're wanting places of privilege in the kingdom. And the rest of the disciples, well, they don't get off unscathed in this passage. They become indignant at James and John for asking such a question. And why are they indignant? Because they think that James and John have jumped the line on them and got ahead of them in asking for this privilege. They're no different than James and John. Their egos are overinflated as well. And so Jesus will give them a solemn teaching. He says to them and to us, you know how among the Gentiles, the pagan people, how their leaders like to wear their fancy robes and walk around with insignias in public and all this gold jewelry around their necks, looking like big authority figures, and people grovel to them? It can't be that way with you, says Jesus. Because in my kingdom, if you want to be great, you've got to make yourself the least and the servant of all. And then Jesus sets the bar. His job description, Mark 10:45, pure and simple. The Son of Man came to serve and not be served, to give his life as a ransom for the many. That word ransom comes from the Greek litron, which is a word that's used in the marketplace. It's the price you pay for something that someone had pawned off at a pawn shop. You pay a litron to get that item. Or if you're trying to free someone who is enslaved, you paid the ransom, the litron, in order to free that person from slavery. And we all know, even those disciples were clueless at the time, we know that Jesus was the one who would give his life to free us from slavery to sin. Well, what's the point of this passage for us today? A couple of years ago, a dear friend of mine from Wheeling, John Bailey, who had been an attorney for a number of years, and a very excellent attorney, I might add, gave me a call to tell me that he had been appointed by the president as federal judge of the Northern District. And so he called me, I remember very clearly, it was during the season of Advent. And he says to me, "Father Jim, got a question for you." And I said, "What, John?" He said, "What's the difference between God and a federal judge?" And I said, "I don't know, John. What's the difference?" He said, "God doesn't think he's a federal judge." Though he had gone before many a federal judge to argue cases, once he sat in that seat, he was amazed at how people groveled before the federal judge. Those people do carry a lot of power and authority. And I will say this much about John Bailey. He really tries to live a humble life as a federal judge. He works all through the week from 8 a.m. to 8:30 p.m. and he takes a lunch break. But when he gets up there on his bench, it's amazing. He's got his big chaw tobacco and he sits there with his little cup, and then he really tries to listen and to show compassion towards the people that come before him. But what he was trying to tell me is that there's a tremendous temptation to throw your weight around, to throw your authority around in a position like that. I remember a number of years ago, I had a priest that came new to the parish as an associate. In my years there, I had 9 up in Wheeling that were associate pastors. This guy came, he was a little bit older guy when he got ordained. And I remember at the little welcoming reception we had for him, you know, with punch and cookies and all that, his older sibling came to me and said, "You know, he's the baby in the family, and I just want to let you know he's spoiled." And I thought, well, that's kind of an odd thing to say about your young brother who just got ordained a priest. But it didn't take long before I found out what he was getting at. We had a crew that decorated for Christmas up there, and they worked hard the whole day decorating that church. They had a game plan, kind of like what Kobe and her crew does. And one of the things they did, in front of the altar up there, it was a big old marble altar. There were 6 steps to get down. And they would take these wooden pedestals and put them on each of the steps, and then they would put poinsettias on top of these pedestals, and so it had a tiered look to it. Well, the crew that evening, one of the women came over to the rectory and got me, and she said, "Father Jim, we got a problem." To which I always say, "You mean you have a problem?" And she said, "We got a problem." And she said, "Father won't let us put any poinsettias on that top step." I said, "What are you talking about?" "He made us take them off." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Because that's where he preaches from." Now get this, the guy preached from this top step in front of the altar, and he would just walk back and forth. And I thought to myself, now wait a minute, there's something not right about this picture. So I called him in later on that evening, and I said, what's the deal with having the poinsettias removed? And he said, "Well, that's where I preach, where they wanted to put those poinsettias." And I said, "You know, there's an old saying among we Italians which goes like this: when in Rome, you do as the Romans do. You ain't in Oz anymore. You know, why not use the pulpit to preach? Why not use the main floor to preach? You know, why not preach over to the right or over to the left? Why must you have that one step?" And I quoted to him Mark 10:45. And I said, "My friend, you better learn the meaning of this passage. The Son of Man came to serve and not be served, and to give his life as a ransom for the many. He had to learn the hard way about the virtue of humility. I remember several years ago, I had a seminarian, a very bright young man that was assigned to me over the summer period. He needed work to do, and I was supposed to supervise him. And because he was so bright, and he would actually go on and earn a doctorate degree, I had him attempt the process of organizing the files in my office. Now, believe me, that's a gargantuan exercise because I hadn't unpacked yet from the seminary. But nonetheless, because he was so bright, I figured he could handle the challenge. And he did very, very well. So one of the evenings, we were sitting around at the supper table, and he looked at me and he said, "Father Jim, you have more letters after your name than you have in your name." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, I ran across this file that had your degrees in there." He said, "Now, I'm not trying to, be nosy or anything, but they were there and you told me to organize." He said, "How come you don't have them framed and put up on your wall?" And I said to him, "Because they don't belong to me." And he gave me this odd look. Because you see, he had gotten caught up in the world of academia, where titles such as doctor, and all your degrees flowing after your name are put as a very important thing to do, so the whole world can know how brilliant you are. And I told him, this is how I look at it. First of all, those degrees belong to God. Because if God had not given me the health, the life, and the gift of this brain in order to earn those degrees, I would not have the education that I have. And I reminded him that one piece of plaque flowing through these arteries in this brain can take care of that brain just like that. But then I also told him that the co-partner to those degrees were those elderly men and women on fixed income who put their little dollars in the collection basket to pay for my education. You see, my seminary education was paid for by you all. I didn't pay a nickel. I couldn't have afforded it. And so, really and truly, that paper in those files that never got hung up and will never get hung up on my walls does not really belong to me. I worked, you paid, and prayed. And so to walk around like some big snooty intellectual is absolutely wrong. So the lesson that the Lord's trying to teach all of us today is about that H word again. You've heard me talk many times about humility. And people have asked me in the past, if I'm going to be a true Christian, what do I need to do? What's most important? And I know they're waiting on me to say, well, you got to have faith. But I never say that because faith is not the most important thing. The most important virtue is humility. And here's what I mean by that. In our society, there is such a concern for self. Egos are so overinflated. We all know people who walk around, prancing around with their titles or their professions and all that kind of stuff. Well, the problem is, if I think I'm the center of the universe, i.e. God, manifest in this world, then how can I believe in God? I'm distracted. I'm looking and seeing only me. It's when I shrink that ego and I become humble and I acknowledge that I am not God, I am not perfect, I am not everything that needs to be, then I can say, I believe that there is one who is, and that is God. Our society is so cutthroat. People are so trying to get ahead, to be people that the world will bow and grovel before. And Jesus says to his disciples and to us, that's not how I want it. If you're going to be great in the kingdom, you got to make yourself small. And that comes through humility. So my brothers and sisters, let us pray that we may learn the lesson that the disciples in Mark's gospel never learned. They never learned it while Jesus was with them, and they didn't learn it throughout the end of the gospel. Let us pray that we may seek the way of humility, that we may surrender to our great God, and as Jesus did, be willing to put others, especially the least, before ourselves.